At midnight, the graveyard was never empty. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Comment below. Where are you listening from tonight? Your voices make these mysteries come alive. Let's begin. On certain evenings, when the moon was high and the mist drifted in from the river, St. Mildred's churchyard had a way of looking almost theatrical. The mossy headstones standing in ranks like silent audience members, the yew trees casting long black shadows over the graves. Most people in St. Mary Mead avoided the place after dark, out of respect, superstition, or sheer English practicality. But on a Thursday night in late September, Mrs. Amelia Price had cause to be there. The vicar's wife, though fond of embroidery and the Women's Institute, possessed an unfortunate habit of mislaying things, and this time it was her embroidery scissors. She had last seen them at the Harvest Decorating Committee meeting in the church hall, and remembering them at nearly 9 o'clock, she decided, against better judgment, to pop over and collect them. She was halfway through the churchyard gate when she heard it. Music, soft, sweet, and thin as cobweb. It drifted over the gravestones, the unmistakable strains of a waltz. She stopped dead, the latch of the gate still in her hand. A violin, she thought, not a recording, not some boy's gramophone mischief, but a real violin. And someone was playing it with a strange, lilting rhythm that caught her throat. Then she saw the figure. At first it seemed like a shadow, a trick of the moonlight on the mist. But no, it was a woman, young or at least slight, her skirts brushing the grass, turning and turning in slow circles as if dancing with an invisible partner. The violin was not hers. She was unaccompanied, her hands free, her head tilted, as though listening to someone who wasn't there. Mrs. Price would later say that the most disturbing thing was not the dancing itself, but the expression on the woman's face, a dreamy, rapturous look, as though she had just been asked the most wonderful question in the world and had said yes. The figure turned once more, then seemed to melt into the far side of the churchyard, past the row of tall yews. The music stopped abruptly, as if cut with a knife. Silence fell, deep and total, save for the faint creak of the lich gate in the wind. Mrs. Price, her skin crawling, made a brisk retreat. She forgot all about her scissors. The next morning, St. Mary Mead had a new topic of conversation. By midday, the tale had acquired all the trimmings, that the woman had been dressed in white, that she had no shadow, that she was seen walking over graves without leaving a footprint. The village was divided neatly into those who dismissed it as nonsense and those who considered it an ill omen. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her garden with her knitting, listened to it all. She had, as always, an air of polite interest, even mild amusement, but her pale blue eyes were thoughtful. In her long experience, there was very little in the world that was truly inexplicable. 3 days later, the explanation, or at least the next chapter, came in the form of a body, discovered in the very same churchyard where the woman had danced alone. The body was found by Mr. Peck, the verger, who had the careful habits of a man accustomed to keys and candles. He came just after 7, his breath leaving puffs in the cool September air, his coat buttoned as neatly as a ledger. He noticed at once that the lich gate latch hung half up, as if a hasty hand had not quite seen it home, and that the grass near the yew walk showed the darker colour it wears when trodden after dew. He was on his way to open the vestry and had no thought for mysteries. He had only the mild resentment of a man who expects to be the first to mark a footprint and finds someone else has already stamped it. He saw the shoe first, protruding from the shadow where the yews stood tall like sentries. He thought for a moment that it was some boy's prank. They had had a spate of such foolishness a summer ago, stuffed trousers and turnip heads and the like. But the shoe did not move, and the thin trousers above it were fine quality, not the sort village boys would ruin for a joke. Mr. Peck set down his keys and went forward, and what he saw sent him backward with a small, neat cry that sounded like a cough. By 8 o'clock, there were 3 clusters of people arranged on the gravel like thoughtfully placed flower beds. The first was official. Inspector Farrow from the county, a broad-shouldered man with a fondness for blunt nouns, Constable Briggs, and Dr. Haydock, who had been summoned to do the sober business for which country doctors are so respected and so disliked. The second was clerical. The vicar, Reverend Lionel Price, whose face had the earnest pallor of men who read a great deal and sleep less, and Mrs. Price, whose embroidery scissors she remembered with a little start and immediately forgot again. The third cluster was the village itself, moving, reforming, breaking into pairs and trios, the human equivalent of minnows in a stream when a stone has been dropped. Miss Marple came last, or perhaps she had been there all along. That was the impression she had a way of giving. She did not push forward. It was not her place to do so. She stood a little apart with her knitting bag, which held no knitting, and looked, as she often did, like any elderly woman enjoying the morning air and a bit of interest. The dead man was Owen Seaton, as everyone knew within 15 minutes, and as Mr. Peck announced with a reluctant importance before being guided to a bench. Seaton had served as caretaker at Hartwood House, which stood closed and echoing on a rise beyond the village, its windows like watchful eyes. He had a reputation for tidiness, for knowing whose dog had strayed and which gate had been left unlatched, and for taking his small pint slowly, as if a pint were a responsibility and not a pleasure. He had also, if one listened to certain voices, and Miss Marple always did, without appearing to, a reputation for keeping small scraps of information in the same tidy way as he kept keys. Head wound, Dr. Haydock said, plain and practical. Fell, perhaps, or was pushed. No marks to suggest a struggle of any length. Inspector Farrow looked around with his hands on his hips as if the churchyard might be persuaded into confession. "And what brought him here?" he asked the vicar, who shook his head sadly, and Mrs. Price, who shivered though the morning had become quite mild. Mrs. Price did not intend to tell the story again. She had told it twice already, once to her husband, who heard it with pastoral gentleness, and once to Mrs. Banbury of the post office, who heard it with avidity. But there is an odd compulsion in certain narratives. They come out of one's mouth as if summoned. So she told it again. The music like cobweb, the woman turning and turning while no one played for her. The way the mist had seemed to gather about her, as if it were a partner's arm. She did not embellish, not now. The presence of Inspector Farrow had a paring knife's effect on her adjectives. When she had finished, the inspector only grunted. "A story like that grows wings," he said, "but we'll have to clip them. Anyone else see or hear anything?" A thin, precise man with an impeccable tie cleared his throat. "I heard no music," he said, "but I heard footsteps quite late, light ones. I assumed Mr. Peck had come back for something, but there was no lantern." This was Mr. Felix Denham, who had let rooms at Rose Cottage for the summer and given lessons in the violin to 2 girls from the school, and to Kitty Bell, the milkman's middle daughter, who had a taste for tragic airs and a fondness for ribbons. He spoke with the mild superiority of men who are used to being listened to in drawing rooms. The inspector looked at him thoughtfully, then at the violin case near Denham's feet, which the man, with a faint smile, nudged behind his leg. "If I had been playing," Denham said, answering the look, "I should have said so. Musicians love an audience, Inspector. We're the only liars who prefer to be caught." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him for a moment and moved on. She had known a music teacher once who eloped with a butcher's wife. He had also spoken in epigrams and thought them original. People began to offer their fragments. Tom Pollard, who did odd jobs at the church and more at the public house, said he had seen Seaton the previous afternoon talking to Lydia Gray in the lane. Lydia had the milliner's shop, a narrow place that smelt agreeably of straw and patience. Lydia, when asked, said that Mr. Seaton had admired a hat in the window. It was a foolish answer, and she blushed as she gave it, which did not improve it. Colonel Arbuthnot said it had been a still night. He had noticed the smoke from his chimney hanging in a straight, polite pillar, and that one could have heard a thrush sneeze. He had heard no violin. Miss Hart, from Hartwood House's estate office, arrived breathless to say that Mr. Seaton had asked her the day before yesterday for the list of old keys. There had been talk, she said, of opening the small west gate to the gardens to check the drains. He was thorough, she added, and dabbed her eyes. It will be said that in English villages, the dead grow virtues like ivy grows on stones. That may be so. Miss Marple thought, listening, that virtues are often drafted after the fact to cover gaps in the narrative. The inspector and the doctor went about their business with firmness and the careful avoidance of speculation that characterizes honest men. The body was carried away. Mr. Peck, having composed himself, went to fetch his broom. There is a dignity in proceeding with one's tasks. The churchyard looked the same as it always had, which is one of the things that unsettles people, the world's indifference to their great alarms. Such a dreadful thing, Mrs. Price said to Miss Marple in a low voice not meant to be overheard, and therefore overheard by half a dozen. And after that girl, that woman, dancing. I am not superstitious, Jane, but one cannot help feeling what one has been trained by life to feel, Miss Marple said and patted her hand. Graveyards do lend themselves to certain ideas. I remember a young man who courted 3 village girls by the same tomb, purely for the dramatic effect. He married none of them and took up accounting. I have always suspected he found a ledger more romantic. Mrs. Price managed a tremulous smile. You think then? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that when people wish to do something that is not to be observed, they choose a time and place where everything observed will be considered remarkable and therefore not believed in a useful way. Fog, for instance, music, or a moon that makes very ordinary footsteps look like the footprints of a legend. A gust of talk from the cluster near the gate reached them. Lydia Gray's name again, then Mr. Denham's, then Miss Hart's, then, unexpectedly, the name of young Roland Seaton, Owen's nephew, who had come down from London a fortnight ago and talked rather too loudly in the Crown about chances and investments. There had been, it appeared, a small scene between Roland and his uncle over tea at the Bluebell Tea Rooms. Mr. Peck's wife, who never told tales but always seemed to think one had already heard them, reported that Roland had raised his voice in that polished way young men do when they wish to be overheard without seeming to raise their voices at all. You can't sit on it forever, he had said. It's mouldering away while you polish keys. Inspector Farrow took statements with the resigned calm of a man sorting buttons by size. He let larger names push forward and smaller ones drift back. He had found it often saved time to let vanity do some of the lifting. He asked Mr. Denham to call at the station later. He asked Lydia Gray to do the same. He was polite to Miss Marple. It is a mistake to assume that policemen do not recognize intelligence when it looks at them through lace. Miss Marple, he said, you heard the talk of a dancing woman. You don't put any store by it, do you? My dear Inspector, she said, people dance for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes the reason is the person they wish to make watch, meaning she wanted to be seen, or that someone wanted her to be seen, Miss Marple said, which is not precisely the same thing. When I see a hat with a very large feather on market day, I seldom think first of the woman who chose it. I think of the woman she meant to pass. He grunted again, but less dismissively than before. We shall see whether there was any such woman, he said. They began to see, every hour that followed, but never very directly. At midday, Kitty Bell, ribbon askew, eyes bright with the appetite for catastrophe that belongs to the very young, confided to anyone who would listen that Mr. Denham had been cross about a string that snapped. G from the Eudoxa, she said with pride, at remembering the name on the paper envelope. He said village strings are like village roads, full of holes. She giggled and then looked stricken, having remembered the dead in time, as children do, not out of unkindness, but because death is a thing that goes in and out of the mind like a draught. In the afternoon, Miss Hart from Hartwood brought a small matter to the vicar. One of the old programme cards from last year's harvest dance had been found on Mr. Seaton's desk, with a name circled in pencil, Lydia Gray. The vicar, who was fond of Lydia, she had made his wife a hat that managed to be both solemn and cheerful, said that such things meant very little. Miss Hart agreed. She had a way of agreeing that added commas where other people put full stops. At 4, a boy came running from the high street, cheeks red, to say that Mr. Rowland Seaton had taken the bus to Much Benham, a suitcase in hand and an expression of injured virtue. Miss Marple, buying a quarter of barley sugar she did not intend to eat, observed that young men who have nothing to hide often look cross and observe timetables with a zeal suggestive of innocence. "But the ones who've something to hide," said Mrs. Banbury. "What do they look like?" Miss Marple smiled. "Like anyone else who wishes to be thought better of than they are." She walked back by the long way, because she liked hedges that had survived 3 wars and a change of fashions. At the lich gate, she paused, because a pause is the sort of thing that shows you what you have. Missed. The latch did not quite meet. The wood showed a fresh scrape, pale against the older grey, about the height of a suitcase dragged by someone who did not wish to lift it. On the gravel below lay a small crushed sprig of thyme, the kind that grows in the vicarage border. Thyme leaves keep their scent when bruised. They whisper their small truth long after feet have gone. Miss Marple bent, not too far, one must be sensible, and touched it. Then she looked up, along the yew walk, to the place where Owen Seaton had lain. It is a curious thing, how an assemblage of trifles will sometimes stand up and bow to you if you look at them kindly. A latch that would not close. A sprig of thyme from a garden where Mrs. Price had spent a fretful hour on Thursday, hunting for scissors she had not found. A violin teacher who denied music, and a milliner who lied clumsily about hats. A nephew who talked of mouldering while his uncle concerned himself with drains. And behind it all, a woman who danced as if saying yes to a question no one heard. Miss Marple stood very still and let the little procession pass before her. She did not lift a hand to stop any one of them. It is not a wise thing to stop a thought before it has found its own chair. When evening came, Inspector Farrow knocked at Rose Cottage and asked Mr. Denham, with the courtesy of a man inviting confession, to take off his jacket. He obliged, amused, and his cuffs were spotless, except for a faint smudge of blue chalk on the left, such as billiard tables leave on careless sleeves. "At the Crown, was it?" the inspector asked. "I played alone," Mr. Denham said lightly. "The village doesn't care for my sort of game." Lydia Gray, in her narrow shop, sat very straight an hour later when Miss Marple came in and asked about veiling. "For Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said. "She feels— oh, we all feel something after a shock, don't we? Something that makes us want to put a thin curtain between ourselves and the world." Lydia's hands, which were very clever with ribbon, shook only once. "I saw Mr. Seaton on Wednesday," she said suddenly, as if saying it to Miss Marple would make it not a lie to the inspector. "He asked me for thread, black. I told him I hadn't any fine enough for what he wanted. I keep hatmakers' weights, not that." She swallowed. He was not an unkind man. He looked tired. Miss Marple said she was sure he often did. People who kept other people's secrets frequently looked as if they had mislaid a pair of spectacles and could not say so. On her way home, Miss Marple met Rowland Seaton coming back from the bus stop after all, empty-handed and attempting nonchalance with the over-eager intensity of a boy learning the waltz. He took off his hat to her and put it on again, too quickly. His hair had been pomaded to a shine that did not belong to the country. "Terrible thing, Miss Marple," he said, and waited, as if praise for the sentiment were required. She gave him one of her mildest looks. "Terrible," she agreed, "and dreadfully inconvenient for anyone with plans." He coloured, which was interesting, and made a small, polite bow. "I have no plans," he said. "Only grief." He walked on, his grief swinging by his side like an empty suitcase. That night, the yews made their usual shadows and the stones held their usual names. Somewhere, far off, someone practiced a scale on a violin, and the notes climbed carefully, like a person trying steps in a darkened house. Miss Marple sat with her lamp and her empty knitting bag and considered human nature, which seldom requires a microscope and never tells you its secret the first time you ask. She thought of time crushed underfoot and of latches that fail to meet, and of the curious way people will stage a scene to distract from the prosaic movements they most wish to conceal. A suitcase over a gate, a key exchanged, a rendezvous at a place where the very mention of a ghost will render ordinary footprints fantastic. Sleep came gradually, like a cat invited to a lap, and before it covered her entirely she thought, not unkindly, that the woman who had danced had either been very brave or very foolish, and that the difference between the two is often no more than the shadow of a yew. The following morning brought a thin drizzle that gave the village the look of a photograph left too long in a damp drawer. Miss Marple, setting her teapot on its mat with the neat precision that had been her habit for more than 70 years, watched the droplets slide down the parlour window and thought that such weather often suited conversations better than sunshine. Sunshine made people brisk. Drizzle invited them to linger and fill the air with the sort of talk that, given enough threads, might be woven into a pattern. She did not have to wait long. By 9:30, Mrs. Banbury from the post office had stopped in on the pretense of delivering a misdirected letter, which turned out to have been correctly addressed all along. She lowered herself into the chair opposite Miss Marple with the air of one about to read aloud from a particularly juicy page. "It's been said," Mrs. Banbury began, "that Owen Seaton had something on Lydia Gray. Nothing wicked, you understand, but enough to keep her agreeable. Now, I'm not saying I believe it." "You rarely do," Miss Marple said with a mild smile, pouring tea. "But people have been putting two and two together. She's been looking pale for weeks, and then there's that business with the harvest dance card. Why keep such a thing unless it meant something?" Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, turning the matter over in her mind as one turns over a coin to examine both sides. People did keep odd mementos. A dance card could signify romance, nostalgia, or merely a tidy drawer where nothing was thrown away. But Owen Seaton had circled her name, and that, Miss Marple thought, suggested intention rather than sentiment. "And Roland Seaton?" she asked, as if it were a passing curiosity. Mrs. Banbury leaned forward. "Back from the bus stop without so much as a tin of biscuits. Says he's been to much Benham on business, but the only business he ever seems to have is at the Crown. And they say he was seen near the yew walk not 2 hours before Mr. Peck found the body." Miss Marple gave a small nod, as though adding a stitch to a row already begun. "That is interesting. Do have another biscuit, my dear. The rain makes one hungry." By mid-morning, the drizzle had become a fine mist. Inspector Farrow appeared at the vicarage and left again within the hour, his hat pulled low. He walked the length of the high street, stopping at Lydia Gray's shop and emerging with no hat box, but a face set in that expression policemen wear when they have not got what they came for. He crossed to Rose Cottage and was met at the door by Mr. Denham, who had the courtesy to invite him in out of the wet. Their conversation could not be heard from the lane, but Miss Marple, who happened to be trimming her front hedge at the time, saw Denham's hand move in a small, quick gesture, the sort a man makes when emphasizing a point he wishes to be taken as the whole truth. Shortly after the inspector left, Kitty Bell hurried along, clutching her violin case as though it contained treasure and trouble in equal measure. She did not stop to gossip, which was remarkable enough to note, and turned into the vicarage path. A quarter of an hour later, she emerged without the case, her eyes wide, her steps quick. Miss Marple, who had moved inside to wind wool, made a mental note to inquire discreetly after the instrument. Young girls did not surrender their prized possessions lightly unless coaxed or frightened into it. After luncheon, Miss Marple decided that a visit to the churchyard would be in order. She took the path past the school, where the children's voices rang out high and thin in the damp air, and entered through the west gate. The place was much as it had been, though a patch of earth near the yew walk showed where the grass had been pressed and disturbed. She paused by the lich gate, tracing with her eyes the scrape on the latch she had noticed before. It was not deep, but it was fresh, and she was almost certain that the height of it would match the rim of a suitcase. As she moved along the gravel path, she caught sight of Dr. Haydock, stooping over a grave with his hands in his pockets. He straightened when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Marple. Bit of air before the next patient." "And perhaps a bit of thought as well," she said, her tone light. He gave a short laugh. "You know me too well. I was thinking about Seaton. No signs of a real fight. Blow to the head, yes, but not the kind you see in brawls. More like a quick, sharp end to a quiet conversation." "Quiet conversations can be dangerous," Miss Marple observed. "One says just enough to make the other person wish one hadn't." They spoke a little more about the rain, the harvest fair, and other safe topics, but Dr. Haydock's eyes had that inward cast of a man who is following a thread to its end. Later that afternoon, news travelled, as it always did, through the narrow channels of the village. Roland Seaton had been seen speaking rather intently to Kitty Bell outside the grocer's. Kitty, for her part, looked uncomfortable, and when Mrs. Price approached them, Roland excused himself with a bow, and Kitty walked away at a pace just short of a run. The picture it painted was not flattering to either party, though Miss Marple thought it perhaps more telling about the contents of Roland's mind than any moral failing in Kitty's. By early evening, the mist thickened, and the lamplighter went about his work with a sort of grim satisfaction that only men who light lamps in unfriendly weather possess. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, knitting at last, when there was a knock on her door. It was Lydia Gray, her face pale, her gloves damp. "I don't know why I've come," Lydia began, but the way she stood twisting the strap of her handbag suggested she knew very well. "I keep thinking about that night, about Thursday, and I wonder if I ought to say—" She trailed off, looking towards the window as if afraid the mist might be listening. Miss Marple poured tea without hurry. "It is often best to speak the thing aloud, my dear. It loses some of its power that way." Lydia sat, her eyes fixed on her gloves. "Owen Seaton came to me a week before he died. He asked if I'd keep something for him, just for a few days. He said it was safer if I didn't know what it was. I told him no, of course. I didn't want to be mixed up in anything. He looked disappointed, but he didn't press me. Then on Thursday, I saw him talking to Mr. Denham outside the post office. They were close, almost shoulder to shoulder, like men making a bargain. I crossed the street so I wouldn't have to greet them. Later that night—" She stopped, shaking her head. "I heard the music too, Miss Marple. Only I thought it was coming from the lane behind the shop." This was new, and Miss Marple noted it silently. "Did you see the player?" Lydia shook her head. Number only the sound. But it was gone in a moment, as if someone had shut a door on it. When Lydia left, the mist swallowing her up at the gate, Miss Marple remained still for a long while. The pattern was forming, faint but definite. A man who kept keys and perhaps other things, a suitcase dragged instead of carried, music where there should be none, and a dance that might have been a signal rather than a whim. The question was not only who had killed Owen Seaton, but what they had been willing to risk being seen doing on the night of his death. It was, she reflected, the kind of question that would answer itself if one could only place the right person in the right conversation at the right time. And then watch, not for words, but for the silence that followed them. The drizzle lifted by mid-afternoon, not to sunshine, but to a pale, wavering light that made the hedges look newly combed. Word went about as it will that Inspector Farrow had been asking all the right people all the wrong questions, which only meant that he had persisted past the first convenient answers. Miss Marple put on her hat and stepped out with the air of one going to admire chrysanthemums, which is a comfortable disguise for going to admire human nature. At the vicarage, she found Reverend Price in his study, with a look of pastoral concern being carefully folded over a knot of practicality. On a chair beside the desk lay Kitty Bell's violin case. He rose, relieved and faintly embarrassed, as though she had caught him in the act of borrowing a ladder. "My dear Miss Marple, You will think me dreadfully fussy, but Mrs. Price was uneasy for the girl. The inspector thought it wiser if Kitty's instrument were kept here for a day or two. Very wise, Miss Marple said. Young things have a way of being pulled into a dance when they only meant to hum the tune. He smiled at that, and after a moment's hesitation, unlatched the case. The instrument lay neat on its bed of worn blue plush, a little rosin dust caught in the corner like a drift of golden pollen. The G-string was new, slightly brighter in sheen. Miss Marple saw, too, a faint scuff of something blue on the leather handle of the case, a smear as if a chalked thumb had pressed there and been wiped, not quite thoroughly. She looked no longer than politeness allowed. Kitty left it willingly, she asked. She did, he said. Mr. Denham had asked to look at it, to see a small adjustment, he called it. Kitty seemed not frightened precisely, caught between wanting to please and wanting not to be made a fool of. And then there is Roland Seaton. He spoke to her yesterday with a good deal of earnestness for a young man who claims no interest in music. Earnestness, Miss Marple murmured, is often a way of disguising one's ignorance as zeal. She took her leave, and in the lane outside she met Inspector Farrow coming from the direction of Hartwood's estate office, his hat dark with the fading damp. He stopped because he always did for her, not from gallantry, but from a natural instinct to gather what could be gathered without appearing to ask. You will have found Miss Hart methodical, Miss Marple said, saving him the trouble. As a ledger, he agreed, and missing one small key. West Garden Gate. He looked at her, measuring how much she already knew. She thought Seaton might have taken it. She says he was tidy about such matters, but tidy men sometimes tuck a thing away to keep it safe and then forget to tell anyone. Or mean to tell and do. Not have time, Miss Marple said. A pity. Did you also find that music teachers dislike being questioned about time? His mouth twitched. Denham says he played billiards at the Crown from 9:30 to 10:15. Landlord confirms he was in the saloon bar and that the table shows blue chalk everywhere, as it always does. So that's neither here nor there. Seaton was likely dead before 10. Leaves us a space, but not a large one. And the dancing woman. Always larger in the telling than in the seeing, Miss Marple said, but large enough perhaps to cover a very ordinary errand. They walked as far as the lich gate together. The inspector's eye took in the scrape on the latch. His hand rested on it, thumb along the pale line. You noticed this, he said without asking. It is my habit to admire new scratches, said Miss Marple mildly. They are so much less reticent than old ones. This one says, I was in a hurry, and I did not wish to lift what I drew behind me. Suitcase. Something of that sort. People drag what they consider not worth being seen to carry. He grunted assent and moved on, summoned by a wave from Constable Briggs. Miss Marple remained, because remaining has its uses. A thread of scent came to her, not lilies, not damp stone, but the faint peppery green of bruised thyme. She glanced down. A second sprig lay farther in the gravel, almost trodden to nothing now. Someone in haste had brushed the vicarage border and left a whisper of themselves behind. At the Crown, the saloon bar wore its usual afternoon expression, which is the same as its morning one with the volume turned down. Mr. Jarvis, the landlord, stood behind the counter polishing a glass in the traditional manner of men who have an interest in being consulted. Afternoon, Miss Marple. Nasty business. Nasty. Inspector says you've an eye. Always did. Poor Mr. Jarvis, Miss Marple said gently. You don't care for corpses any more than hens do for foxes, but you're glad of the inspector's hat on your hook. She asked, in the tone of someone hoping for a simple reassurance, whether the billiard table had been much used the night before last. Mr. Denham had it to himself, Jarvis said readily. Plays a fancy game, he does. Walks round the table like a cat, chalk on his sleeve when he paid. I noticed because it's a smart sleeve to put chalk on. 10:15 he was off. Time's a thing I have to know, Miss Marple. Closing, you see. And young Mr. Roland. Here before 9, gone before 10, back again after. One of those were you looking for me, or shall I be seen men? He sniffed. If I had his hair, I'd keep away from rain. On leaving the Crown, Miss Marple found herself addressed, almost immediately and with theatrical surprise, by Roland Seaton, who had materialized out of the doorway of the tobacconist. "Miss Marple, you do get about." He laughed as if they shared a joke about her age that flattered them both. "One must walk while one can," she said. "It makes you acquainted with gates." He blinked. Gates. So many in a village, Miss Marple said, and each with its own small habits. Latches that lift easily, latches that stick, latches with a new scratch that tell you some person has abused their good nature. "Really?" Roland said, too airily. "I'm sure the police will be delighted to catalogue our scratches." "They already are," Miss Marple said, and watched the quick constriction at his throat before he could laugh again. "How sad for your uncle." "Yes," he said, his voice pitching itself low. "Terrible for us all. He was, well, he had his ways." He shifted, then leant nearer in a confidential manner which men suppose becomes them. "If you hear people say I quarrelled with him, don't think too ill of me. Older men can be tiresome about change." "Change," Miss Marple said, "is only agreeable when it is paid in the coin one prefers." She let him go with that. It is often kinder to let young men think they have made an impression. After tea, the evening turned dry and even a little crisp. Constable Briggs, sent to look again along the yew walk with the patient eyes of a man who knows he will be told if he misses anything, bent to a glimmer in the gravel and called out. Inspector Farrow came, and Mr. Peck came, and because it is the nature of villages that people are fetched by the sound of a name, Miss Marple came too, slowly, as if her feet had decided before her head. Briggs held up a small bent strip of tin with a hole in one end. The surface, though scuffed, still showed faint stamped letters. H, W, W, G, D, N. "Hartwood," the inspector said. "West Garden." He looked towards the road, as if he might see the great house from here. "So Seaton's key label came this way." Mr. Peck, diffident in the presence of capitals, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's also this." He held up a shred of black net caught on a nail of the gatepost, a triangle no bigger than a postage stamp. Lydia Gray's name moved through the group like the softest of breezes. Miss Marple took the fragment in her fingers, then let it go. "Coarse weave," she said, almost to herself. "Machine made, inexpensive. Miss Gray keeps Russian net for proper veils. She would not wear this even in her storeroom." Inspector Farrow pursed his lips. "So we have a bit of theatre for the night. Someone wanted a veil who didn't own one." "And a key label torn where it might catch," Miss Marple said, "which suggests haste rather than care." "Haste is an honest witness. They parted with that. Policemen do not broadcast their subjects, and old ladies do not require them to." But half an hour later, Mr. Peck, who had gone to put away a hymn board and emerged from the vestry with more colour in his face than is comfortable, for a man of his habits, came stumping across the gravel to where the inspector stood. "If you please, sir," he said, "there's a thing I don't hold with in the house of God, and that is people stowing their parcels where they've no business." He gestured, outraged propriety warring with affronted curiosity. "Up under the organ stairs. I was dusting, as I do, and my broom knocked at it like it was a rat. Not a rat. A case. By then the light was thin as paper. They fetched it down together, Inspector Farrow and Briggs, while Mr. Peck made warning noises about the floorboards and set it on the vestry table. It was a suitcase, plain brown, with a torn leather corner and a handle shaded darker by use. The latch bore the same new scrape that marked the lich gate. Everyone looked at it as people look at a box that may contain either a harmless hat or a bomb that will rearrange one's neighbours. Miss Marple stood a little back, not because she was afraid, but because she had learned that revelations like privacy. The inspector lifted the catches. They sprang with a resigned sound. Inside, wrapped in a length of old table linen, lay not the expected parcels of money that rumour produces so readily. nor jewels that Hartwood had never been known to own. It was a violin, dark with age, its varnish warm as old honey, its bridge a little higher than modern fashion, its tailpiece fitted with an ivory finial carved into a forget-me-not. On the underside of the table linen, at one corner, Miss Marple saw a small cross stitched in blue cotton, the kind of tiny serviceable mark housemaids put on linen to keep it from wandering. Inspector Farrow said nothing for a moment. Mr. Peck said, with a righteous sort of sorrow, "Well, I never." As if the Lord's house had been used for a music hall turn. Constable Briggs sucked in his breath through his teeth. "Hartwood," Miss Marple said softly. "The housemaids there used to mark their table linen with little crosses at the corner. Mrs. Abbott, the old housekeeper, insisted on it. She said it made the corners remember where they belonged. And this," the inspector said, touching the ivory finial, "remembers where it belongs too, I shouldn't wonder. Denham will know if it's worth more than a tune." He wrapped it again, more carefully than his hands looked capable of, and closed the case. "No word of this beyond the necessary," he told Mr. Peck, who swelled with the dangerous pride of a man entrusted with secrecy. "Miss Marple," he added, with a gravity that made her incline her head, "you have a way of seeing the next square on the board. Is this our motive?" "Motive is a word like weather," Miss Marple said. "The same rain falls on many heads, and some take colds and some grow roses. But I think a violin of value would make certain people rash, and others helpful in the wrong way." She looked at the handle again. There was, beneath the chalk smear, a faint, green scent that had nothing to do with old wood. "And I think our night work passed through the vicarage border in its hurry." They carried the case to the station under a rug that did not disguise it from anyone who knew what a rug will not disguise. On the way, they met Mr. Denham coming from Rose Cottage, with his tie set beautifully and his face carelessly at ease. He lifted his hat and saw nothing but two men with a rug and an old lady with a parasol. That is to say, he saw everything and nothing at once. Miss Marple inclined her head and thought of Kitty's new G-string and of the way music will always draw the eye where the ear is. When she reached home, the evening had settled properly. The lamp made its small pool. She set her hat on its peg and sat down in the chair that had learned the shape of her thoughts. It had not been jewels then, but something equally tempting to a man who loved notes more than people. Yet the torn key label and the suitcase scrape spoke also of another hand, less practiced, more impatient. Two desires sometimes hitch themselves to the same cart. The cart moves faster than either desire intends, and often tips. Miss Marple folded her hands upon nothing and found that it was not nothing at all. A man tidier with keys than with people, dead without a scuffle. A nephew who needed change quickly. A teacher whose sleeves confessed to chalk while an old violin lay in a church. A milliner asked to keep a parcel she refused, and who wore veils too fine to leave a coarse scrap on a nail. And somewhere in the middle of it, as necessary as a refrain, a woman turning to a waltz that might have been a signal, or might have been the answer to a question no one else had heard. The next step, she knew, was not to accuse, which is noisy, but to arrange, which is quiet. There are conversations one must place in a certain order, so that human nature, left to itself, will say what it has been trying not to. Outside, the church clock struck the quarter, with the sober honesty of machines that keep time whether one likes it or not. Miss Marple counted it without meaning to, and in the pause that follows such counting, she decided that in the morning she would ask Kitty Bell to play the waltz again, in the lane behind the shop, and she would watch to see who arrived too soon, or too late, or not at all. The next morning dawned cool and clear, the mist having retreated to the hollows beyond the meadows. Miss Marple, taking her tea at the small table by the window, watched the early walkers pass along the lane. Most nodded, some slowed with a half-hope of conversation, but she allowed them to drift on. She was thinking of Kitty Bell and the waltz. If a piece of music had been used to draw someone to a particular spot, the only way to know for certain was to see if it would work again, and more importantly, to see who could not help themselves from coming. By 10 o'clock, she had made the necessary arrangements with the ease of a woman who had spent decades asking favors that never felt like burdens. Kitty, when approached, was both flattered and a little nervous. "Just in the lane, Miss Marple, like I did Thursday. I could. It's a pretty tune, that one. Mr. Denham taught it me." She bit her lip after saying it, as though realizing she might have confessed to something she didn't yet understand. Miss Marple, in her gentle way, reassured her. "Music is only guilty when it's played badly, my dear. We'll choose a time when most people will be about their business. Those who aren't will be more noticeable." They agreed on 11:30, when the baker's deliveries kept the high street humming, but the lane behind Lydia Gray's shop was quiet enough for a melody to carry. Miss Marple said nothing to Inspector Farrow beyond a vague remark about keeping one's ears open. She had learned long ago that policemen value results more than explanations in advance. At the appointed hour, Kitty stood in the lane with her case open and the violin tucked under her chin. The first notes were tentative. She had the shy stiffness of someone conscious of being overheard. But soon the waltz began to turn in the air like a leaf caught in a warm breeze. It had that lilt which makes people slow their step without knowing why. Miss Marple sat on a small bench near the corner where the lane met the green, apparently occupied with sorting the contents of her knitting bag. The first to appear was Lydia Gray, emerging from her shop's back door with a bundle of hat frames in her arms. She stopped mid-step, her eyes flicking towards Kitty, then down to the gravel, before she hurried away in the opposite direction. That in itself was interesting. Avoidance can be as revealing as approach. Moments later came Mr. Denham, walking at a pace too quick to be casual. He turned into the lane as if on some errand, but his eyes went straight to Kitty's fingers on the strings. He paused, made a show of adjusting his cuff, and then stepped forward. "You've been practicing," he said, the words just audible from where Miss Marple sat. Kitty coloured and played a little louder, perhaps in pride, perhaps in embarrassment. Denham leaned in, murmured something, and Kitty faltered on a note. From the far end of the lane, Roland Seaton appeared, hands in his pockets, hat at an angle that suggested effort rather than ease. He slowed as he drew nearer, looking first at Kitty, then at Denham, and finally at Miss Marple. He tipped his hat to her with a touch of forced charm and said, "Morning," though his eyes didn't linger. Instead, they settled on the violin with a narrow sort of focus, as if trying to decide whether it was the same instrument he had seen before, or perhaps the one that had gone missing. Miss Marple noted all this without lifting her head from her bag. Denham moved away after a brief word to Kitty, his mouth set in a line that might have been satisfaction or annoyance. Roland lingered a moment longer, then made an unconvincing show of checking his watch before walking on towards the green. When the last note of the waltz faded, Kitty lowered the instrument. Was it all right, Miss Marple? Only I thought Mr. Denham seemed—" She broke off, unsure whether she ought to say it. "You played very well, my dear," Miss Marple said, rising. "And you noticed something, I think. That is good. Keep noticing." She sent the girl off with a smile and turned her steps towards the high street. She found Inspector Farrow near the post office, conferring with Constable Briggs over a list. "I've just had a little concert," she told him lightly. 3 attendees of note, or perhaps of interest. She gave him the order in which they had appeared, and his eyes sharpened. "So the music does draw them. Denham, I can see, being the teacher, but Roland." "People are often drawn to the thing they believe belongs to them," Miss Marple said, "or ought to." They walked together towards the churchyard, Farrow frowning in thought. "You think they all knew about that violin?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that in a small place, very little of value remains entirely unknown. And value isn't only in money. Sentiment, prestige, the satisfaction of possessing something that once belonged to another, these can be very strong motives, especially if the rightful owner no longer has the strength to guard it." As they reached the lich gate, Farrow glanced at the latch again, his thumb brushing the scrape. "You're certain about the suitcase?" "As certain as one can be without carrying it oneself," she said. "And I am certain about the time. A hurried passage from the vicarage towards this gate, with something that caught here, at the latch. The same scrape as on the handle of the case found in the vestry. The path is not long, Inspector, if one knows where one is going." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded towards the yew walk. "We'll have another look along here. Perhaps we've missed something yet." They found nothing fresh in the gravel, but near the base of one of the yews, half hidden in the moss, Miss Marple's eyes caught a sliver of something pale. She stooped, pinching it delicately between finger and thumb. A torn fragment of stiff paper, the kind used for luggage labels. The corner still bore a faint penciled R. She handed it to Farrow without comment, and his brows lifted. "R for Roland." "Or Rose Cottage," Miss Marple said, "or something else entirely. But in my experience, initials have a way of pointing where they are not meant to." They parted there, Farrow heading for the station with the fragment, and Miss Marple continuing on towards the vicarage. Mrs. Price met her at the gate, full of new anxiety. "Have you heard? They say Roland has been making inquiries about selling a violin. In much Benham of all places. Some shop there, I don't know the name." "That is interesting," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "Though selling something one does not yet possess can be awkward." Mrs. Price looked puzzled. "Do you mean he doesn't have it?" Miss Marple only smiled and made a small remark about the roses, which were indeed in fine bloom for the season. But as she walked away, her mind was already arranging the players on her mental board. Denham, whose skill and familiarity with valuable instruments could make such a violin disappear into a private collection without fuss. Roland, who needed ready money and saw in his uncle's possession, or perhaps in Hartwood's, an opportunity. Lydia, whose refusal to keep Seaton's parcel might have been prudence, or fear of being caught in the middle. And Owen Seaton himself, tidy and cautious, who perhaps realized too late that more than one person knew the value of what he held. The waltz had drawn them, each for their own reason. That, Miss Marple thought, was telling. When people are lured by a sound, it is not always because they like the music. Sometimes it is because they remember the last time they heard it and what was promised or exchanged then. In the quiet of her garden later that evening, she let the pieces turn in her mind. The dancing woman in the graveyard had been a spectacle, yes, but perhaps also a message. A prearranged signal to show that the way was clear, or that the handover could begin. Under the cover of such an odd sight, a suitcase could be dragged unseen, a key used, an object passed. And if something went wrong, if words were exchanged that could not be taken back, then a single, sharp blow could silence the disagreement forever. What remained was to know which of those drawn to the waltz had been there that Thursday night, and which had arrived later to take advantage of what had already been done. That knowledge, Miss Marple felt, was very close now. The trick was to let them talk just enough to reveal it without knowing they had done so. And that, she thought, was rather like coaxing a shy tune from a violin. You needed the right touch, and the patience to wait for the note you were listening for. The following day brought with it a deceptive calm, the kind of bright, windless morning when the village seemed to busy itself only with the ordinary. Yet Miss Marple knew that under the neat surfaces of such days, things tended to shift. People thought more freely in fine weather, walked a little farther, and, if they were of a nervous disposition, betrayed themselves in the small ways that a watchful eye could catch. She began her morning with a call at Lydia Gray's millinery shop. Lydia was bent over a hat in the making, the crown covered in half-pinned ribbon that trembled faintly under her fingers. She looked up with that quick, bright expression which, in Lydia, was always just a shade too quick. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd be busy with the inspector." "Oh, he's quite busy enough without me," Miss Marple said, examining a small display of veils. "But I was passing, and I wondered, Do you happen to carry coarser net? Something for everyday wear? For working women? Lydia shook her head, her mouth tightening before she softened it into a polite smile. No, only the fine Russian net. Coarse stuff is common in the drapers, not here. Miss Marple nodded, as though it were exactly what she had expected. I thought as much. Funny, though, how a scrap of the coarse kind can find its way into the churchyard. The ribbon stilled under Lydia's fingers. You mean… She stopped, perhaps realizing she'd been about to offer more than was wise. There are many visitors to the churchyard, Miss Marple. One can't account for all of them. No, one can't, Miss Marple agreed, her tone as mild as warm milk. She selected a small length of pale blue ribbon and paid for it without further comment. But as she left, she saw Lydia's hands return to the crown of the hat with a stiffness that spoke of some inner calculation. On her way back along the high street, Miss Marple encountered Kitty Bell, carrying a loaf under one arm and looking as if she had been in two minds about approaching her. Miss Marple, I wondered, do you think I ought to tell the inspector about Thursday afternoon? Miss Marple slowed her step. Why don't you tell me first, my dear? Kitty glanced around. It was just… Mr. Rowland came to the shop. He asked me if Mr. Denham ever gave me music to learn at home. Written music, I mean. I said sometimes, and he wanted to know if any of it had names on. I thought it odd, but I said no, because it's true. Then he said, if anyone asked, I was to say I hadn't seen him Thursday evening. He smiled when he said it, but… She shrugged, her youth uncertain how much weight to give to such an instruction. Miss Marple smiled faintly. When people tell you what to say before you've been asked, it's usually worth remembering. By midday, Inspector Farrow called at Miss Marple's cottage, bringing with him the faint smell of pipe smoke and a mood of determined patience. The label fragment, he said without preamble, matches the luggage Owen Seaton kept in his storeroom. His initials were OS, so the R is curious. We've checked Rose Cottage. Denham swears he's never had a case with such a label. Miss Marple poured tea. Curious indeed, though sometimes people reuse labels. I have a hat box with a ticket for London Victoria that hasn't been there in 20 years. Farrow accepted the cup, but kept his eyes on her. You've the look of someone who's turned something over and found a glint underneath. Only that a case might change hands more than once, Miss Marple said, and in the changing, labels are not always removed. If Mr. Denham did not have it, perhaps someone wished it to look as though he did. That would serve to point suspicion in one direction and away from another. He grunted, not in disagreement, and set down his cup. We've traced that violin. It's from Hartwood House, part of an old collection, left locked in the West Garden store after the last tenant moved out. Only 2 keys for that gate. One in the estate office, one held by Seaton. We've the estates, the others missing. Miss Marple thought of the key label found near the U's and of Seaton asking Miss Hart for the list of old keys. A missing key, a valuable violin, and more than one person aware of it. Inspector, if you wanted to move such an object without drawing notice, when would you choose to do it? Night, obviously, he said, though it's riskier. Unless, Miss Marple said gently, you arrange for something else to occupy every eye and ear, something strange enough that those who see it will have difficulty persuading others it mattered. A woman dancing alone in the graveyard, for instance. Farrow's expression shifted, the lines around his mouth sharpening. You think that was deliberate? I think, Miss Marple said, that Owen Seaton's death may not have been planned, but the opportunity to take that violin was. And perhaps the person who created the diversion was not the one who delivered the fatal blow. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard again, lingering near the vestry door. Mr. Peck emerged with his usual slow precision, locking up behind him. Terrible business, Miss Marple, and I don't like thinking someone put that fine instrument under the organ stairs. It's not fitting. No, Miss Marple said, but convenient. Tell me, Mr. Peck, was the vestry door locked Thursday night? He frowned. It should have been, but sometimes if you don't lift the handle just so before you turn the key. He trailed off, embarrassed. Well, Anyone who knew the trick might think it shut when it wasn't. And who would know the trick? He considered. Mr. Seaton, of course, and me. Possibly young Roland. He's been in and out with his uncle before. And Mr. Denham's been in here when the choirs practiced. Miss Marple thanked him and strolled on, her thoughts arranging themselves into two clear threads. One led from Hartwood's West Garden gate, through the yew walk, to the vestry. The other looped from the lane behind Lydia's shop where music played, to the graveyard where a woman danced. The place where the two threads crossed was Thursday night, and she suspected that in that crossing lay the truth. Near dusk, she paused by the vicarage garden, looking at the time border. The crushed sprigs had faded now, but the gap in the neat edge was still visible. Mrs. Price, coming out with a basket, followed her gaze. "I've been meaning to replant there. Funny, I didn't notice it till Friday morning. Looks like someone tramped straight through." Miss Marple nodded, as though only mildly interested. "Possibly carrying something awkward, perhaps. Something easier dragged than lifted." Mrs. Price considered. "Could be. It's narrow, but I suppose you could get a case through. You think it's important?" "All footprints are, my dear," Miss Marple said, "even the ones that don't show." That night, as she sat with her knitting, she went over the order of events again. The dancing woman and the music, the signal. The suitcase dragged through the vicarage garden to the lich gate, the missing key, the coarse scrap of veil meant to suggest Lydia, the violin hidden in the vestry, perhaps to be collected later, and Owen Seaton, who must have seen or understood something in that moment, only for a quick, precise blow to end his part in the story. There was still a question of timing. Who was where and when? But she had learned long ago that people's alibis, when examined in the light of small details, often grew less certain, and she had a plan for testing those details. Tomorrow she would speak to Inspector Farrow about arranging a conversation in which each of the principal players might think themselves unnoticed, yet all would be within earshot. Sometimes the truth revealed itself not in what was said to a policeman, but in what was whispered when the policeman's back was turned. She set her knitting aside and reached to turn out the lamp, her mind calm now that the pieces were aligning. Somewhere among Denham's polish, Roland's eagerness, Lydia's unease, and Kitty's stray remarks lay the simple human motive, not greed alone, but the layered resentments and opportunism that so often made otherwise ordinary people capable of dangerous things. And in the morning, she meant to see it plainly. By the time the sun had climbed over the rooftops the next morning, Miss Marple had already decided where the conversation would take place. It needed to be somewhere ordinary enough to seem harmless, but enclosed enough that the participants would have to cross paths. The Bluebell tea rooms served admirably, a place of lace curtains, sponge cake, and the kind of acoustics that carried a murmur from one table to another without the speaker noticing. She arrived just after 11, settling herself at a corner table with her back to the wall, where she could see both the door and the narrow passage leading to the back room. She ordered tea and scones, the sort of order that meant she could linger as long as she liked. Then she waited, her eyes mild, her hands busy with a length of pale blue ribbon she had bought the day before from Lydia's shop. Roland Seaton appeared first, his hat set just so, his expression carrying that faint air of self-consciousness that young men acquire when they expect to be noticed. He glanced around, spotted Miss Marple, and offered a courteous nod before choosing a table not far from hers. A few minutes later, Lydia Gray entered, in a dove-grey coat and gloves that matched so precisely they might have been made for a shop window. She greeted Roland with polite reserve, then took the table between his and Miss Marple's, removing her gloves slowly, as though to avoid catching them on the lace cloth. It was Mr. Denham who completed the triangle, arriving with a purposeful air and his violin case slung casually in one hand. He acknowledged both Roland and Lydia with a nod, then chose a seat directly across from them. He placed the case on the chair beside him, the gesture as deliberate as a man putting a prized possession in sight but out of reach. The tea room filled gradually with the soft chime of teaspoons and the low hum of conversation. Miss Marple poured her tea, her head bent, her ears open. Roland spoke first, his voice pitched to be heard by Lydia, but not by the rest of the room. "You didn't say you were coming here." "I didn't know I was," Lydia replied, the edge in her tone softened by the surroundings. "And if I had, it wouldn't have been for your benefit." Denham gave a small, amused laugh. "Still sparring, I see. I hope this isn't about the same matter as before. The less said, the better, wouldn't you agree?" Roland's mouth tightened. "That depends on what's already been said." Miss Marple stirred her tea as if attending to nothing more than dissolving sugar, but in truth she was measuring the rhythm of the exchange. Denham's voice was easy, almost too easy. Roland's, defensive. Lydia's, guarded. The waitress arrived with tea for Denham, placing the pot down close to the violin case. He shifted the case slightly, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the brief flicker of his gaze towards Lydia, not cautious, but watchful, as if he were weighing her reaction to its presence. Lydia, for her part, kept her eyes firmly on her cup. "I suppose," Denham said lightly, "we'll all be dragged into the inspector's net before long. Best to keep our lines straight." "That's easy for you," Roland said. "You've nothing to explain, have you?" Denham's smile did not waver, but there was the smallest pause before he replied, "Nothing that matters." The waitress brought Miss Marple her scones, and for a few moments the conversation at the other tables covered any reply. When the room settled again, Lydia was speaking. "Some things do matter," she said quietly, "especially when people think you've done something you haven't." Roland leaned closer to her. "Then you should be careful not to give them reason to think it." Walking away that night, I walked away because I wanted no part of it," Lydia cut in, her voice low but firm. "And you'd do well to remember I said no when I was asked to help." Miss Marple let her gaze wander to the window, as though distracted by the sight of a sparrow on the sill, but inwardly she noted the slip. Lydia had been asked to help, with what, she had not yet said, but the implication was plain enough. Denham set down his cup with a deliberate clink. "The trouble with refusals," he said softly, "is that they make other people nervous. Nervous people do rash things." There was a silence after that, filled only by the muted clatter from the counter. Roland shifted in his chair, his jaw working as if he were biting back a response. Lydia sipped her tea without looking at either man. Denham reached for a slice of cake, the movement smooth and unhurried, as though nothing of consequence had been said at all. Miss Marple finished her scone and rose, making her way past their tables with a small nod to each. She did not linger, but as she passed Denham's chair, her eyes brushed the violin case. A faint smear of pale green still marked the leather handle, almost gone now, but unmistakable to one who had seen its twin on the time-crushed border. Outside, the air was crisp, the street alive with the shuffle of feet and the rattle of a cart on cobbles. She walked slowly towards the churchyard, letting her thoughts arrange themselves. Lydia's refusal, Roland's defensiveness, Denham's watchfulness, each was a fragment, but they were beginning to form an outline. The violin had been taken from Hartwood House. Seaton had held the key and the knowledge to do it quietly. Someone had used the distraction of the dancing woman and the music to move it, dragging the case through the vicarage garden to the lich gate. Somewhere between that point and its hiding place in the vestry, Seaton had met his end. She paused by the gate, resting her hand on the latch. The scrape was weathering now, but still visible. Looking down the yew-walk, she imagined the scene. The dim light, the mist hanging low, the faint sound of music drifting from the lane. A figure moving quickly, head down, case in hand. Another stepping from the shadows, a sharp word, perhaps a demand. And then, a single, efficient blow. As she stood there, Inspector Farrow approached from the far path, his coat collar turned up. "I was coming to see you. We've had word from Much Benham. Roland Seaton did indeed ask about selling a violin, described it in some detail. The dealer there told him it would fetch a fine price, but Roland said he'd have to settle matters before bringing it in. Settle matters, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, a phrase that can mean anything from finding the key to removing an obstacle. Farrow nodded. You think he's our man? I think, she said, that he is one of them, but not the only one. The taking of the violin and the death of Owen Seaton may have been intertwined, but they are not quite the same thing. There is a difference between a thief and someone who finds an opportunity to stop a man from speaking. They walked together along the path, the yews, casting long shadows across the gravel. At the vestry door, Miss Marple paused. You might consider, Inspector, whether the person who hid the violin in here meant to return for it at once, or whether it was to be passed to another. And if the latter, what became of the arrangement when Owen Seaton was no longer alive to keep his part of the bargain? Farrow gave her a sidelong look. You've an idea. I have the beginning of one, she said, and tomorrow I may have more. But for that, I shall need a little more music. Her eyes rested briefly on the pews through the open vestry door, as if she could already hear the faint, haunting notes of the waltz drifting over the graves once more. Not as a signal this time, but as a lure to draw the truth into the open. Inspector Farrow took Miss Marple at her word about the music. By the next afternoon, a modest parish practice had been contrived with the kind of innocent fuss that never alarms the guilty. Mrs. Price would arrange hymn sheets. Mr. Peck would see to the lamps. Kitty Bell would run through something nice before the choir came in. The vicar would be in and out. It was not an event to be announced, merely a thing that happened, like apples ripening or washing days arriving with the weather. Miss Marple, who looked best among such ordinary arrangements, spent part of the morning with Dr. Haydock under the pretence of discussing chilblains. She emerged with something far more useful, the knowledge that bruises tell time if one listens. A sharp, concentrated blow delivered to a standing man, likely by something hand-ready and smooth-edged. She tucked it away with all the other small truths. At noon she took tea with Mrs. Banbury and allowed the woman to deliver an entire sermon on Roland's shoes, which squeaked, and therefore signified moral weakness. Miss Marple did not find shoes morally instructive, but she did consider the squeak. A nervous gait often announced itself before the man who wore it found his resolve. By 3, the church had that restful emptiness peculiar to afternoons when the light falls in kind bars and dust behaves nicely. Kitty tuned, her face solemn with the responsibility of playing on sacred ground. The vicar moved in and out like a kindly moth. Mr. Peck rattled in the vestry. Miss Marple sat in the third pew from the back, with her hands folded upon her bag, which contained nothing but a ball of wool that had no intention of being knitted. Inspector Farrow was nowhere in sight, which was exactly where he meant to be. Kitty began with scales, the young sound plainer and more honest than any polished performance. Then, after a small nod from Miss Marple, she let the waltz into the air. It unfurled with the same half-smiling melancholy that had drifted across the graves the night Owen Seaton died. The notes slipped along the stone, around pillars, through the open door. Lydia Gray appeared first, as if the melody had picked the lock of her restraint. She came quietly down the aisle and stood to one side with her gloves in her hand, not quite taking a seat, not quite going away. Her eyes, in that good, sensible face, were watchful rather than romantic. After a moment, she inclined her head towards Miss Marple without surprise. Some women recognize when they are being asked to witness rather than attend. Mr. Felix Denham came next, with his careful walk and that small smile which suggested the world would improve if it listened. He did not bring his case. He paused at the back, then drifted to the side aisle where the acoustics suited a connoisseur. Kitty's fingers, seeing him before her face, allowed itself to, faltered and then recovered. Denham inclined his head to her in the schoolroom manner that conferred encouragement while collecting debt. A little later, the squeak of Roland Seaton's shoes announced him in the porch. He entered with an expression of injured piety that ill-fitted his hat. He touched the holy water stoop as if it were a gentleman's club table and took a position just inside the door where a man can flee as readily as he can listen. Miss Marple did not turn her head for any of them. It was the other sound she waited for, the tiny metallic click that means a latch has been tried by someone who knows it sometimes yields. She heard it at the vestry, faint as a coin against china. Mr. Peck, dutiful at the organ stairs, cleared his throat loudly and shuffled, and there followed a silence that meant whoever had tried the door now thought better of being seen trying it. Kitty finished the waltz and let the bow fall. In the hush that followed, a small thing happened. With the astonishment of a shout, a scrap of coarse black net slid under the vestry door, pushed by a draught or a finger, came loose of its catch on the nail, and lifted like a moth. Lydia saw it. Her cheeks coloured with the old tired anger of being framed by someone untidy. Roland saw it. His jaw worked. Denham did not look at it at all, which is sometimes the most eloquent glance. Miss Marple rose then, without hurry, and went towards the vestry as if going to admire a flower arrangement. She bent, picked up the scrap between finger and thumb, and smelt it, not of old drawers and camphor, not of millinery, but of the faint, stale sweetness of common starch. "Drapers," she said gently, and handed it to Mr. Peck. "Would you be so kind?" Mr. Peck, who knew when theatre was asked of him in the house of God, bore it like a monstrance out into the aisle and, after an apologetic bow to Lydia, placed it on the pew for all to see. Lydia, composure gathered with both hands, said nothing. Miss Marple, with the same small courtesy she brought to tea, turned to Kitty. "My dear, run the first strain once more." Kitty did. On the third bar, a shadow crossed the porch glass. The door opened a little. The squeak of Roland's shoes retreated into the sunlight. Denham shifted, eyes on Kitty's left hand. Lydia remained, her chin lifted. Inspector Farrow chose that moment to come down the north aisle with unhurried steps and a countenance innocent as cake. He nodded to Miss Marple, admired the stained glass, and addressed no one in particular. "We've had word about the violin, Miss Marple. Our man in Reading says the instrument from the vestry is worth money, but not the money that makes men foolish. He calls it a gentleman's instrument. Fine enough, but the real prize is its sister from Hartwood, the one the last tenant kept in a locked press, reputed to be of a maker whose name makes hands shake. Our vestry piece bears a rather recent tailpiece with a dainty flower that could be moved from one to another by a man who knows how to sell with his eyes." Denham's head came round at that, controlled, attentive, the way a cat looks at a cupboard door when it believes there's meat behind it. Roland's face, half turned at the porch, performed an interesting series of decisions and arrived at none. Lydia let out a small breath that might have been relief and might have been grief for a thing she had not possessed. "So," Farrow went on in that tone of practical musing country policemen cultivate to great effect, "someone placed a lesser violin in our vestry to slow us and sweeten suspicion. The pretty finial was borrowed to make a relation look like a twin. Meanwhile, the true thing," he opened his hands, "is elsewhere." "Elsewhere," Miss Marple repeated, as if tasting the word. "But not far. Men who think themselves clever seldom are energetic as well." "Indeed," said Farrow. "And there's this." He drew from his pocket a clean handkerchief, unfolded it, and displayed a paper sliver like the one found near the U's. This one bore more lettering, R.O. in clear pencil, and beneath it a faint, oily impression as from a rubber stamp, H.W., as on the tin tag. "Found stuck under the vestry mat, where it would do no good to anyone but a man searching for an alibi. Mr. Denham assures me he has never owned a case so labelled. Mr. Roland assures me he has never labelled anything in his life. Miss Gray assures me she has no interest in cases attached to graves." He folded the handkerchief. "Assurances are generous in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's eyes travelled, not accusingly, merely like eyes that know the difference between chorus and soloist. The scrap of veil was meant to be picked up, she said mildly. As is so often the case when a woman's virtue is to be offered as evidence and therefore as distraction. But a man who buys coarse net from the drapers does not understand that it creases at the selvage in a way a milliner will not tolerate. And chalk, even when wiped from a sleeve, will set itself in the seam of a case handle with a loyalty rare among friends. Denham's laugh came, charming as a stolen tune. My dear Miss Marple, one might suppose you had already tried me and found me wanting. No, she said. Not wanting, wanting too much, which is different. She turned to Kitty, whose bow hand trembled now with being part of something beyond her. Mr. Denham taught you this waltz, didn't he, child? And said that if you played it at a certain time, he would know whether you had kept up your practice. Kitty swallowed. He said a musician ought to be punctual. Almost always, Miss Marple agreed, but thieves must be more so. Farrow did not look at Denham. He looked instead at Roland, who had drifted back 2 steps and now hovered like a moth near a lamp. And you, sir, you asked in Much Benham what such a violin would fetch. The dealer there says you described a label and a scroll you would only know if you had seen the thing out of its press, not in a drawing room from a distance. Were you shown it, I wonder, by a man who needed your nerve and your stupidity, each in small measure? Roland blazed with offended youth. I won't be spoken to like, then don't be used like a crowbar, Farrow said gently. A movement then behind the vestry door, the smallest sigh of wood. Mr. Peck, who had been hovering, opened it in his church way, as if expecting the Holy Spirit and prepared to say, "Do please come in." He found no dove, only a new disturbance. The vestry had been disturbed again. The dust on the table showed the oval wiped clean where the old suitcase had lain. In its place lay a folded cloth, heartwood linen by the Blue Cross, and upon it a single thing, the ivory finial, unscrewed from a tailpiece and left like a calling card. Lydia's hand went to her mouth. Kitty whispered, "Oh." Roland, who did not love music but did love money, took one automatic step forward and stopped himself as if at a cliff's edge. Denham looked, only looked, and that looking was the most revealing act of the day. Hunger, regret, and a gambler's calculation measured in a second's span. A second visit, Miss Marple said, as if remarking upon weather. To retrieve what could not be explained away when the inspector began to speak of twin sisters. Such haste makes slips. A finial undone in the dark becomes a breadcrumb for tidy men. Farrow's voice was perfectly calm. Briggs is in the north porch, he said to the heir. Jarvis is watching the Crown. No one will take a bus today without sharing our company. He glanced at Miss Marple. Shall I? Not yet. Her tone was kind, almost indulgent. There is one more note to be played. She turned to Lydia. My dear, will you tell us quietly what Owen Seaton asked you to keep? Lydia's cheeks flushed, but she stood very straight. He wanted me to keep a key. He said it was only for a day or 2. I refused. I didn't want to be mixed up in men's arrangements. And you were right, Miss Marple said. But someone else kept it. Mr. Roland, perhaps, whose uncle could be managed with pints and persuasion, or Mr. Denham, whose hands understand how easily a twin can be dressed to resemble its sister. Owen meant, I think, to hand over one thing and keep back another until he could be sure of his safety. He misjudged what men will do when a night has been contrived with music and theatre to make them brave. Kitty, who had put down her bow as if it had become hot, whispered, Who danced, Miss Marple? Someone who knew how to be seen without being known, Miss Marple said. Someone in a coarse veil that would make people say Lydia because Lydia wears veils and sells them, though never that kind. Someone smaller than the woman Mrs. Price described, but wrapped and padded as actresses pad parts to please the gallery. Someone who would dance if asked by the right teacher and would run if told to by the wrong man. She turned her kind, inexorable gaze on the girl. "You danced a little, didn't you, child?" "Only a turn or two, because Mr. Denham said it would be a joke for the harvest play, and you were to practice in the churchyard where the grass is soft. And when the music stopped, you were told to go home by the lane and say nothing, because surprises are how players make their effect." Kitty's eyes filled, not with guilt, but with the shock of having her innocence counted aloud. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought, he said it would be pretty." "I know," Miss Marple said, and there was no unkindness in it. "Pretty is a dangerous word in men's mouths. It makes conspirators of children." She looked past the girl to the men. "That leaves the blow. A quarrel over a case in the U-Walk. Not long, not loud. A man who had set a small stage for theft, who sees his tidy plan threatened by a careful caretaker who won't hand over a thing without keeping the string of it in his fingers. A smooth object raised quickly. A handle, perhaps, or the edge of a case. And Owen lies down where Mr. Peck found him. And the music is over. Farrow moved then, not quickly, but with that steady purpose old bulldogs have when they have sniffed their quarry's coat. He did not go to Roland first. He went to Denham. "We shall take your sleeves, sir, and your hands, and any tools you have that unscrew delicate finials in the dark. We shall also take your word, if you wish to place it on the table with the rest of the litter. Mr. Roland will come too. If either of you would like to make less of yourselves than the other, there's time before the tea is cold." Denham looked down at his fingers, clean, expressive, treacherous as any actor's. He glanced at Roland and for once misread him. The young man's vanity and fear had reached that delicate balance where speech becomes a relief. "He told me to go," Roland blurted, the words tumbling. "He said to stay out of the churchyard until the case was in the vestry, that he'd make it look like she did it, and that Seaton would only make trouble if we let him. He said the key would come to me after, and I could sell. I didn't hit him. I swear I didn't. I wasn't there when—" "Thank you," Miss Marple said softly, as one thanks a child for setting down a heavy vase. "That will do for now." Outside, the bells in the tower stirred as if the rope had been touched by accident. The church held its breath in that curious way old buildings do when a story reaches the place where it must choose its ending. Miss Marple sat down again in the third pew from the back, folded her hands upon her bag, and thought how very predictable people can be when they are trying to behave unpredictably. The next movement would be quiet and deliberate, and because human nature prefers to be coaxed rather than pushed, almost graceful. She had asked for one more note. It had sounded. Now came the coda. The church seemed to exhale after Roland's outburst, the faint echo of his words lingering in the wooden beams as if the old building itself had been listening. Inspector Farrow let the silence stand for a moment, giving the weight of confession its due. Denham's expression had not altered much, but there was a stillness in him now, the kind of stillness that comes when a man measures whether resistance will preserve his dignity or prolong his trouble. Roland, on the other hand, looked almost relieved, as though unburdening himself of the tangled knot had, in some small way, freed him, even if it tethered him to other consequences. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her pew, was watching not the men, but the girl. Kitty's face was pale, her fingers twisting in her skirt. She was replaying, Miss Marple guessed, the evening in the graveyard, searching for signs in memory that had gone unnoticed at the time. The tone of Denham's voice when he'd asked her to dance. The way his eyes had darted past her shoulder. The swift, quiet dismissal when the music stopped. Guilt did not belong to her, but the knowledge of having been used sat heavy on her shoulders. Farrow moved then, signalling to Constable Briggs, who stepped forward from the porch where he'd been keeping watch. "Mr. Denham," Farrow said, his voice even, "we'll take you and Mr. Seaton to the station now. There's still the matter of the key, and the matter of the true violin from Hartwood House. It would be wise to speak plainly before those matters speak for you. Denham glanced at Miss Marple before replying, and in that glance she read the same calculation she had seen in other men. The reluctant acknowledgement that the quiet old lady in the corner knew exactly where the game had gone wrong. "I'll speak," he said finally, "but I'll not hang alone for this." "The idea was his," he added, jerking his head towards Roland. "But the execution was mine. I'd heard of the heartwood instrument long before I came to this village. Seaton was just the sort of caretaker who could be persuaded to hand over a thing if he thought it would stay in the family. Roland here fancied a quick sale, and I fancied keeping the finer piece for a private buyer. It would have worked too, if the old fool hadn't got suspicious at the last moment." Roland flared at that. "I never told you to kill him." "And I never said I did," Denham returned, the faintest smile on his lips. "But when a man's temper rises, and there's a heavy case in his hand, accidents happen quickly." The inspector's face did not change, but Miss Marple saw the flicker of understanding pass between him and Briggs. She also noted that Denham, for all his cleverness, had chosen his words carefully enough to admit involvement without placing the blow in his own hand. That, she thought, was telling. As they were led out, Lydia stepped forward, her chin high. "Inspector," she said, "if you've no further need of me, I'd like to go back to my shop. I've customers waiting." Farrow studied her a moment before nodding. "You've been helpful, Miss Grey, more than you know." When they had gone, the air in the church shifted again, becoming lighter but not yet easy. Miss Marple rose and walked slowly towards the vestry, pausing at the door where the faint scrape of the latch still marked its recent history. She opened it and stepped inside. The table where the case had rested was bare now, save for a small trace of dust in the exact oval shape the suitcase had made. Beside it, she noticed, lay a thin length of pale cord, the sort used for tying bundles of music or, perhaps, securing a tailpiece. It had been cut cleanly at both ends. She picked it up and returned to where Farrow stood near the chancel steps. "Inspector," she said quietly, "this was left in the vestry. I rather think it belonged to our missing violin before the finial was removed. Whoever came back for it didn't have time to tidy every loose end." Farrow took it from her, examining it briefly. "You think the true instrument is still close by?" "I think it's closer than they'd like you to believe," Miss Marple replied. "A man may be quick to hide what he's stolen, but if he intends to collect it later, he will keep it somewhere that doesn't inconvenience him. And Denham strikes me as a man who dislikes inconvenience." They left the church together, the last of the afternoon lights slanting low across the green. The few villagers who lingered outside the crown turned their heads to watch them pass, their eyes bright with the hunger for the latest turn in events. Mrs. Banbury was already recounting some version of the afternoon's scene to a cluster of listeners, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple set the length of cord on her table and sat a moment in thought. The case had been hidden in the vestry to be retrieved later. The finial had been removed to disguise one violin as another. The scrap of veil had been planted to misdirect suspicion. But the true heartwood instrument, the real prize, had never yet been produced. That meant either it was already in the hands of Denham's private buyer, or it was still somewhere within reach. And if it was within reach, someone else in the village might yet be keeping it safe, knowingly or not. Her eyes drifted to the ribbon she had bought from Lydia's shop. Pale blue, the exact shade of the cross-stitch on the heartwood linen. She thought of the folded cloth found in the vestry, and of Lydia's quiet assertion that she had refused Seaton's request. It was possible, of course, that Lydia had spoken the truth. But it was also possible that she had refused him on Thursday only to agree under different terms later, when the key had already passed to other hands. The next morning, Miss Marple called at the millinery shop again, this time with a small hat box in her hand. Lydia looked up from her work with a guarded expression. "Back so soon, Miss Marple?" "I wanted to ask if you could repair the lining in this," Miss Marple said, setting the box on the counter. "It's rather an old one, but I've kept it for sentimental reasons." Lydia lifted the lid and peered inside. "Yes, I can fix that. It will need new ribbon. I thought perhaps pale blue, Miss Marple said, watching her closely. It's such a distinctive shade, the sort the Hartwood housemaids used for their linen. For just a fraction of a second, Lydia's hands stilled on the brim. Then she smiled, perfectly polite. It's a common enough shade, Miss Marple. Many suppliers carry it. Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course. I dare say I'm imagining the resemblance. She left the shop with the quiet satisfaction of one who has heard what she came for, even if it was not spoken aloud. Later that day, she walked to the vicarage, ostensibly to bring Mrs. Price a recipe for seed cake. In the back garden, the thyme border had been freshly trimmed, the gap where it had been crushed now almost gone. But on the far side, near the small shed where the vicar kept gardening tools, she noticed a length of coarse brown paper tied with the same pale cord she had found in the vestry. The parcel was about the size of a violin case. She did not touch it. Instead, she stepped inside and found Mrs. Price arranging flowers in the hallway. Such a pretty day, Miss Marple said, though I imagine your husband's been busy in the garden. Mrs. Price beamed. Yes, he's been tidying up. Even found an old parcel someone must have left in the shed. I said I'd ask around before opening it. It's probably something for the jumble sale. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, do ask. One never knows what treasures might turn up in an old parcel. When she left the vicarage, she went straight to the station. Farrow listened without interruption as she described what she had seen. It's the right size, she concluded, and the cord is the same. I'd be very much surprised if the Hartwood violin were not in that parcel. Farrow's jaw tightened. If you're right, then it never left the village. Denham must have passed it to someone for safekeeping, thinking the shed would be overlooked. Or perhaps it was placed there without his knowledge, Miss Marple said. There are more hands in this than we've seen, and I think Owen Seaton knew that, which is why he became dangerous to more than one person. By evening, the parcel had been taken into police custody. Farrow confirmed what Miss Marple had already guessed. Inside was the true Hartwood instrument, its finish deep and lustrous, the maker's name hidden beneath the tailpiece. Denham and Rowland would now have to account not only for the theft, but for the elaborate deception that followed. Miss Marple, back in her parlour with the lamplight pooling softly around her, reflected on the chain of small details: a scrape on a latch, a crushed sprig of thyme, a smear of chalk, a shade of ribbon, each insignificant alone, yet together forming the map that led to the truth. Human nature, she thought, was much the same. The smallest things, overlooked in the moment, told the clearest stories once one knew how to read them. And somewhere in the village, the faint memory of a waltz still lingered, carrying with it the image of a woman dancing alone in the graveyard, a scene both strange and beautiful, and, in the end, the curtain raiser to a crime that was as much about vanity and ambition as it was about music. The day after the Hartwood violin was recovered from the vicarage shed, the village had settled into that peculiar hush that comes when gossip has been satisfied, but curiosity is not yet spent. People had the facts, or what they thought were the facts, and now each retelling was shaded with the speaker's personal embroidery. Mrs. Banbury swore that she had seen Denham leaving Rose Cottage with something long under his arm a full week before the murder, while Colonel Arbuthnot claimed he had always suspected Rowland of slippery tendencies, owing to his unfortunate preference for patent leather shoes. Miss Marple allowed the stories to circulate without correction. It was the way of things. If you tried to still a current too soon, it only found another channel. She preferred to let it run its course, knowing that the little scraps people added for colour sometimes gave away more truth than they realised. Inspector Farrow, however, was not content to wait. He came to Miss Marple's garden gate late that morning, his hat in his hand, and a look that was neither wholly satisfied nor wholly puzzled. "We've got enough to charge Denham and Rowland with the theft," he said, "and enough to show they were in that churchyard the night Seaton died. What I don't have is the piece that ties one of them, or both, directly to the blow that killed him. And until I do, there's room for them to wriggle. Miss Marple set aside her secateurs and led him into the parlour. There's wriggling room in most crimes until the human element is understood, she said. You see, Inspector, it isn't always the man with the plan who delivers the decisive act. Sometimes it's the one who feels the moment slipping away from him. Farrow frowned. Roland? Possibly. He had the most to lose if Seaton decided to keep the violin or involve the police. But I don't think it was premeditated on his part. The opportunity came, and he took it. She paused, pouring tea with the unhurried precision that made her points sink in more firmly. But the way the scene was staged afterward, the veil, the planted scraps, the hiding place in the vestry, that smacks of someone who had rehearsed his movements. That sounds more like Mr. Denham. The inspector sipped his tea, considering. So you think Denham set it up? Roland struck the blow, and then Denham tidied it to fit his design? I think, Miss Marple said, that Denham meant to collect the violin without any confrontation at all. The music, the dancing, those were to mask the movement of the case. But Seaton was a careful man. He may have intercepted Roland, thinking the young man was acting alone, and Roland, frightened of losing his chance, lashed out. After that, Denham's tidy instincts took over. The whole business with the finial and the substitute violin bought him time. He thought to keep suspicions scattered long enough to move the real instrument out of reach. Only, she added gently, people who overestimate their cleverness often underestimate everyone else. Farrow nodded slowly. And that's where you came in? Oh no, Inspector, she said with a faint smile. That's where human nature came in. I merely observed it. The next step, they agreed, was to see whether either man would confirm her theory under the right pressure. Farrow proposed separate interviews, knowing that those who share a crime rarely share its retelling exactly. Before he left, Miss Marple asked him to tell her afterwards, not what they admitted, but what they tried hardest to deny. That afternoon, she went to see Kitty Bell. The girl answered the door with a mixture of shyness and relief, as though she had been waiting for this visit. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, she began, for saying I didn't know what I was part of. It's true, I didn't. I thought it was just a bit of fun, but now I keep thinking, if I'd stayed longer, if I'd seen… My dear, Miss Marple said, taking her hand, you might have been in danger yourself. You were sent away at precisely the right time, and that tells me Mr. Denham didn't want you as a witness to anything that came next. That, in itself, speaks volumes about his part in the business. Kitty's eyes widened. So he really was using me? In a way, yes, Miss Marple said kindly. But you mustn't let that trouble you too much. We've all been used at one time or another. The trick is to learn to recognize it sooner. When she left Kitty's, the evening light was stretching long shadows across the green. She met Lydia Gray coming from the post office, a letter in her hand. Lydia hesitated, then fell into step beside her. I hear they found the violin in the vicar's shed, she said. I suppose that means you were right about it never leaving the village. Miss Marple gave a small nod. It does, and it also means that someone trusted the vicarage garden enough to use it as a hiding place. That narrows the list considerably. Lydia glanced at her, then away. You don't think I… My dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently, if I thought you had, I wouldn't be walking with you now. The trial, when it came, was not for Miss Marple to concern herself with. The law would take its course. But in the days before it began, Farrow returned to tell her how the final pieces had fallen. Denham had admitted to planning the theft and to orchestrating the distraction, though he insisted he had left the graveyard before Seaton was struck. Roland, under questioning, had admitted to confronting his uncle, to demanding the key, and to shoving him in anger when the old man refused. The blow had been delivered with the corner of the suitcase, more by chance than design, but fatal nonetheless. They'll both serve their time, Farrow concluded. Roland for the killing, Denham for the theft, and the rest of it. Neither comes out clean. No, Miss Marple said softly, and neither will quite understand that it was not the violin itself that ruined them, but the way they imagined themselves entitled to it. On the morning both men were taken away, Miss Marple walked through the churchyard alone. The grass along the yew walk had grown over the disturbed patch, the scrape on the lich-gate latch was weathering to grey, and the thyme in the vicarage border had filled in its gap. There was no trace of the woman who had danced there, nor of the music that had accompanied her, yet she could still see it in her mind. A figure turning slowly under the moonlight, a waltz winding through the mist, the illusion of something romantic and strange, masking something entirely practical and sordid. She paused by the spot where Owen Seaton had fallen, her hands resting lightly on the head of her walking stick. "You kept your keys well, Mr. Seaton," she murmured, "but you trusted the wrong men." As she left the churchyard, she saw Mrs. Price approaching with her basket. "It's a blessing it's all over," the vicar's wife said. "Though I do suppose people will be talking of it for years, and to think it all began with that dreadful business of the dancing woman." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. People will remember the dancing, I expect, long after they've forgotten what it concealed. That is often the way of such things." She walked on, the sound of her steps blending with the rustle of leaves overhead. In the quiet that followed, it seemed almost possible to hear the faint echo of the waltz again. Not as a signal now, nor as a cover for crime, but as a reminder that in villages like St. Mary Mead, the oddest happenings often have the most ordinary of causes, and the most ordinary of people are capable of the oddest things. The weeks that followed saw the village return to its slow, familiar rhythms, though with that faintly sharpened awareness that always lingers after a scandal. The post office queue hummed with speculation, the churchyard regained its peaceful air, and the grave where Owen Seaton rested was soon marked by a modest stone, chosen, Mrs. Price said, to suit his tidy nature. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had been content to let the excitement ebb. The inspector had thanked her more than once, though he had remarked, half in jest, that she had made the matter sound almost simple in the telling. That, she reflected, was because she had left out the long hours of listening to what people thought they were saying, and noting instead what they were careful to leave unsaid. She sat one afternoon in her garden, the last dahlias nodding in the autumn breeze, when Lydia Gray came through the gate. The milliner looked more at ease than she had in weeks. "I wanted to say," she began, "that I'm grateful you believed me. I kept thinking, if you hadn't, I might still be under suspicion." Miss Marple smiled. "I believed you because I knew the coarse veil wasn't yours. That little scrap was meant to be found, and meant to point in your direction. A clever enough trick, but human nature is so often betrayed by the small details. You would never have tolerated such inferior work in your shop." Lydia's smile was a shade wry. "It seems such a lot of trouble for a violin." "It was never only the violin," Miss Marple said gently. "For Mr. Denham, it was pride, the pleasure of outwitting others and possessing something fine. For Roland, it was desperation and the belief that family should provide for him whether they wished to or not. And for poor Owen Seaton, it was loyalty, first to Hartwood House and then to his own conscience. Those motives tangled together until one night, with music playing and a small scene unfolding in the churchyard, it took only one rash moment to turn theft into murder. They talked a little longer of harmless things, and when Lydia left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the steady click of the needles matching the slow, comfortable beat of the village beyond her hedge. A few evenings later, she walked through the churchyard again. The moon was high, and the mist curled faintly over the grass, though no music drifted through the stones this time. She paused by the yew walk, recalling each step of the investigation. The crushed thyme, the scrape on the latch, the smear of chalk, the way the waltz had drawn the guilty back to the scene of their crime. Every clue had been small, easily overlooked, but together They had formed the pattern she knew so well, the pattern of human nature behaving exactly as it always had, no matter the century or the crime. She made her way to the lich gate, resting a moment before stepping out into the lane. In the stillness, she could almost imagine the faint echo of a violin playing a fragment of the waltz, not ominous now, but wistful, like a memory of a time before greed and fear had entered the picture. Miss Marple straightened her shoulders and walked on. Another mystery was finished, the truth settled where it belonged, and the village would soon find some new, harmless diversion to talk about over tea. But she knew, as she always did, that somewhere, in some small corner of human behavior, the seeds of the next puzzle were already taking root. And when they bloomed, she would be ready.